So Australia's election has just wrapped up, and we are just under 3 years away from the next one, in all likelihood, in 2028. And I've seen a bit of discussion going around about how Susan Lee is essentially a bench warmer, and that she is not going to be the next Prime Minister by any means. She is essentially there to hold the party together until the next leader takes over, because in some people's minds, 2028 is a foregone conclusion. And based on the state of politics at the moment, that Labor is going to win that election with almost like a 99.9% degree of certainty. And this video here is me presenting my argument for why that is absolutely the case. Now, this is not going to be a breakdown of policy or personality or examining Susan Lee and Albo and what would make them win an election. This is more just looking at the electoral math and the absolutely astronomical, daunting task that is facing the Liberal Party in the next election, and why, by most conventional understandings of Australian politics, the idea of the Liberal Party being able to run a campaign to be able to win enough seats to form a government, minority, majority, either way, is kind of beyond the realm of possibility. So if we look at the parliament here, we see the problem. There are twice as many members of the Labor Party as there are members of the coalition, pretty much. And the problem there, before we get into the Labor versus the Liberal contest, is the first big issue is the crossbench. That big chunk of independents there are mostly teal independents, which the Liberal Party is going to find it really hard to form majority government without somehow beating those teal independents, which is a mammoth of a task in itself. The issue when it comes to beating independents is that there is a political norm in Australia that when independent politicians are elected, particularly to the House as MPs, they tend to stick around for a long time, and that's kind of a consequence of what they are. Unlike party politicians, they don't have like secondary commitments to an organisation to worry about. For example, if you're an independent local MP, realistically, you don't have to attend any cabinet or shadow cabinet meetings. You don't have to worry about inter-party politics in Canberra. You don't have to worry about pre-selection. What you really realistically have to do is stand up in Parliament, argue in favour of your electoral division and the community that you represent, and you get to spend a lot of time in your electorate basically campaigning even when the election season isn't even on. So independents always have that advantage of not being associated with a political party, and normally, at least in my experience, being particularly popular in their local communities. Because if people successfully run a campaign to engage enough voters to win as an independent in a federal seat, it's probably because they're in pretty high standing and they kind of get like a celebrity status. I know, like, visiting Warringah recently, like Zali Steggall is a remarkably popular politician in her community. And ever since she got in, beating Tony Abbott, her margins have only gotten better and better because people like her and they like the idea of an independent voice speaking for them in Parliament, which is what a lot of people actually like once they get independent MPs. And the Teals themselves are relatively well-financed. And look, there may be some changes to campaign finance over the horizon, but for the time being, the funding and the organisation that they get from Climate 200, whether you think that is a good thing or a bad thing, certainly helps those Teal independents stay in their positions of power. But that essentially means that if the Liberal Party or the broader coalition wants to get back to majority status, it's going to have to take the fight specifically to Labor at an inherent disadvantage because it doesn't have those traditional heartland seats that the Teals now have. So now that we understand the difficulty of the Teals, let's look at this as if it is just a two-party contest. If it is the coalition versus Labor, what does it actually look like for the Liberals to get somewhere where it would be considered victory? Well, first and foremost, if just assuming that the crossbench doesn't exist or it's just not competitive or there are no changes there, the coalition would need to win 33 seats from the Labor Party, which would be the single biggest swing in terms of seats from one party to another in Australian political history. So if we look at the post-election pendulum for the 2025 election, which is basically all of the seats in the country put onto a list of how marginal they are, if the coalition wants to win the 33 most marginal Labor seats currently held by the government, they are going to have to get a uniform swing from state to state, from division to division, of about 8%, which would represent the biggest swing in terms of two-party preferred vote since World War II, which I don't imagine the Liberal Party in its current state is anywhere near capable of. So that's majority government off the table. Realistically, Susan Lee and Albo going head-to-head is not going to result in the kind of election that is so monumental and unique that it parallels, if not surpasses, elections that we have had in the past during one of the world wars. So is there another path to government for the coalition? Well, maybe, and this is where we get into the question of, could they get to minority government status in 2028, and what would the conditions need to be for that to happen? I'm afraid to say, for anyone that supports the coalition, it still doesn't look great for them. So if the coalition's goal in 2028 is just to surpass Labour in total seat count, again, completely ignoring the crossbench, the coalition just wants to be in a position where it can more effectively argue that it should be the government than the Labour Party. The Liberal Party would need to win still 26 seats from the Labour Party, which we haven't seen that amount of shift since 1996 when John Howard came in. And that was after more than a decade of Labour rule finally coming to an end with Paul Keating. Again, that is not the situation that we are currently in. We're nowhere near that in Australia's current political climate in terms of frustration with the government. And again, looking at pure swing in terms of votes that they would need, if they wanted to win 26 seats from the government, the coalition would need two-party preferred, a swing towards them of 6.5%, which, and not to kick Susan while she's down, I don't think she's capable of that. And look, hypothetically, yes, the Labour Party could lose the next election. But the issue is they are in such an advantageous position at the moment, and this has been proven before, that even when a government is unpopular, if they have the sheer quantity of seats available, then it just becomes a purely incomprehensible challenge for the opposition. We've seen this in 1998. Howard became incredibly unpopular, but because he had won 94 seats at the previous election, and the party was in such a beneficial position, they lost the popular vote, but they still held on. And that is just a reality of Australian politics. It's like what I mentioned with independents. Incumbents, more generally, tend to have an advantage. It's purely based on the fact that, at least this is my interpretation of why incumbents in Australia have an advantage, is that the kind of person that is willing to switch their vote from Labor to Liberal, is engaged enough to make that sort of decision, is probably also engaged enough to know who their local MP is. And local MPs don't tend to be incredibly unpopular. If you have recognition and barring some awful controversy, people will probably trust you more than some other party nominee that they've never heard of. And the Labour Party currently has that advantage in 94 seats. 94. And you also have to consider that at no point in the Labour Party's history has it had so many members of Parliament not be in cabinet. The cabinet is only comprised directly of actual cabinet members, ignoring secondary assistant ministers, of about 30 people. That means that most of the parliamentary caucus of the Labour Party are not actually members of cabinet, and they don't have to spend that much time in Canberra. These are people whose their full-time job is to vote for the Labour Party and to get re-elected at the next election. The Labour Party has never been in this position before. It has never had so many MPs who can spend pretty much all of their time, if not a vast majority of it, in their electorates, building their relationship with communities and ensuring that they are well known enough and popular enough to get the support of those communities at the next election. The shadow cabinet, by comparison, of Susan Lee makes up a very big chunk of all of their parliamentary members because of how much of a rump their party currently is. So, of course, shadow cabinet members don't have to spend as much time in Parliament, but they are expected to be there to make responses and to respond to government policy. So there is that issue of the Liberals don't have that many of their members just in their communities doing the work. Because their party is so small, they have to keep a disproportionately high amount of their MPs in Canberra. So I've painted the picture as best I can to give you an understanding for why the next election realistically isn't going to result in a change of government. And putting on top of everything that I've painted so far, briefly touching on the political reality, I mean, the Labour Party that is currently in government is a much better operation than the previous Labour government, the Labour government of Rudd, Gillard, Rudd. This Labour government has proven that it is much more stable internally. And Albanese seems to have a hold on the reins pretty well. So this isn't going to be a 2010 again, at least from what I can see, where the Labour Party is going to collapse in on itself and open up the door for a Liberal win. Susan Lee cannot count on that like Tony Abbott could. So look, I think Susan Lee will get a swing towards her if she is still the leader in 2028. Because 2025, this year's election, was a once-in-a-generation political beatdown that I don't think it's likely we will see again for quite some time. Things will readjust. Some traditional Liberal voters will come back to the coalition and support Ley, I think, because by default, she is much better than Peter Dutton ever was. But I don't think that Ley is the kind of opposition leader, the kind of once in half a century fantastic opposition leader that would be able to turn this current situation around. And because of that, I think 2028, barring some enormous catastrophe, is a lock for the Labour Party. And the next Liberal Prime Minister, well, it's certainly not going to be Susan Lee.